FBI was stupid. From the beginning, they made massive mistakes, like searching the rugged mountainous terrain 30 miles too far north for a man named Cooper. Between the makeup, Raleigh cigarettes, and sipping bourbon, his disguise was perfect.
Yes, his disguise was perfect. Sometimes the obvious can be right in front of you and you just can't see it. Sometimes our government is more concerned about covering their mistakes than the truth, and we just can't see it. Sometimes the government agenda becomes the goal. My name is Dan Grider. I didn't solve this D.B. Cooper case. I'm not an investigator, and I'm certainly not a filmmaker. My efforts have centered around the goal of forcing the FBI to come clean on this one. And now it's pretty obvious it just needs some resolve. Yes, resolve. Now the FBI has been forced to take some kind of an action. They were in 2 homes illegally, and they contracted to kill a man as their final solution to this long-running agency embarrassment. This case is over. No one can condone the actions of Richard and Karen McCoy in 1971 and 1972. Hijacking is not only illegal, it's just not a great idea. The mystery that has endured all these years has now been shown to be a product of government agenda. They were looking in the wrong place. They couldn't find him. They couldn't prevent his second hijacking. Their prison system couldn't hold him, and he exceeded their agency ability. The easiest answer was just to eliminate him. That became their agenda, creatively disguised as simply not solvable. When you finally see what's in front of you the entire time, then it all makes a little more sense. At some point, someone has to pull that disguise off. D.B. Cooper, Part 4, Deep Government Agenda. I got a lot to explain. How did you like that intro section? I shot that to try to give you a little bit of illustration into the world of disguise. I'm not much on disguises. I'm not very good at it, but I thought I'd try to illustrate that. How'd you like that? This section has a bunch of video. I'm going to include in sections here. This is D.B. Cooper, Part 4, Deep FBI, Deep Government Agenda. I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about here. We're going to start with our CNN section. Yes, I was on CNN. We got about 50 or 60 media outlets around the world that carried the story about D.B. Cooper, our parachute find. I got some explaining to do, and I'm going to explain that. Here's our section with CNN. I can tell you, going into CNN, they give you no briefing. I was on there twice live. I had no idea what to expect or how it was going to work, where to look at. All of a sudden, you're on the couch and it goes live. In the process, they don't even tell you what the questions are going to be in advance. So I was totally caught off guard on both of them. Yes, I know the subject, but they don't give you any briefing. Let's show you this section next. This is CNN. This is the second one of them. This video here is at 1.6 million views on CNN's YouTube channel right now.
I think that shot, Kelvin can get it really low. Now I can pick up the spot. Stand by.
So this is a mystery that has baffled people for generations, and especially the FBI since 1971. Who is D.B. Cooper, the man who managed to hijack a plane, parachute out with $200,000 and disappear? Did he leave? Where is the money?
Well, a former pilot and YouTuber says he's got some of those answers for us. Joining us now is Dan Grider, volunteer host of the YouTube show Probable Cause. Dan, it is great to see you. I have been trying to get my head around this crazy story and how you discovered this parachute which you've been looking for years now, right? Tell us the backstory.
Yes, good morning. Thanks for having me. Yes,
Yeah.
It is a crazy story. America has been enamored with this story. 53 years ago, the guy jumps out of the airplane with $200,000, never to be seen or heard from again. What people don't know is that there was another one exactly like it 6 months later. Same guy did both of them. He went back and fixed all the little problems that he had on the first one, namely being able to hold on to the money.
So let's start here. Richard McCoy, who is he? And take the similarities between these two hijackings in 71 and 72 and bring us forward to how you came to this property and potentially a piece of the evidence.
Well, it all started with this book. There was two government men that wrote this book in 1990, and it's on the table here. I got interested in this after this book was published, but the book got shut down. Those two guys published this book that said, without a doubt, Richard Floyd McCoy was D.B. Cooper. They wanted to put that through at the time, but they got shut down because the search warrant on the second hijacking was illegal. After he did his second hijacking, they busted into his house, but their search warrant was not proper. Therefore, they were almost in danger of having the second one thrown out. So that's how I ended up on this. I read this book and started down that path, and it's been 20 years of traipsing around carrying video cameras and going to all these locations.
Okay, so you brought a piece of that parachute that you found. Can we see it?
Yes, I have a sample of the actual parachute canopy. This was found in July 22 in Richard Floyd McCoy's mother's possessions. She had recently died, and we ended up in her. This canopy has never been seen or touched by human hands, but I'll let you touch it. This is the
that
actual.
okay?
Sure. This is the actual sample of the canopy from D.B. Cooper. That's the actual parachute that lowered him to the ground, November 24 of 1971.
And so Richard McCoy was known as the hijacker in 72. The question was he also responsible for the hijacking in 71? And when you found this evidence from the 71 hijacking on his property, you think you have this evidence that links him. How do you know that this is the shoot? This is part of the rig from the 71 hijacking.
The one question that they asked that I did not get a chance to answer properly, how do we know that the parachute that I found is legitimate? Well, I can tell you right up front, I am not an antique military bailout parachute expert at all. I'm a civilian jumper. I'm not even a rigger. I don't build those things. I don't alter them. The old military bailout rigs from that time period are not something that I am an expert on. All I can tell you is that the FBI completely bumbled this investigation from the very beginning. Obviously, all that we know for sure, the things in common, are that we are looking for a green military bailout rig that started life as a bailout rig and got modified. How did it get modified? Well, it got D-rings installed. The rig that I found definitely got cut open and D-rings installed and sewn back together. D-rings were installed. The ripcord was definitely moved. The packing tray on back got enlarged. The canvas area in back. And how do we know that this is the D.B. Cooper rig? Because it was done by Earl Causey. Earl Causey actually signed this rig with his own signature. I'm going to show you the stitching here. This is definitely Earl Causey cheap, junky stitchmanship. He wasn't much of a seamstress. He was a good packer. He was a horrible seamstress. This is Earl Causey's work right now. This is video footage of the actual rig that I found. How do I know that it's the rig? Well, it was in McCoy's property. It was in his mother's possessions. She was storing it for him as a keepsake. Yes, for sure. How do we know that this is the actual D.B. Cooper rig? Well, we're looking for a green military rig that started life as a bailout and got converted to be a sport rig. That's all I can tell you. Is it an Air Force rig? Is it a Navy rig? I don't know, because the FBI messed up their 302 files and their statements conclusively. They absolutely got this entire thing messed up. There's not one single eyewitness piece of information, handwritten statement from anybody, including Earl Causey. They're all via this thing called the 302. I'm going to tell you about the 302. The 302 is a form. It's a record, a memorandum of conversation. It is third, fourth, and fifth-hand information at the very best from the FBI, transcribed to a secretary who sits down at a typewriter to type it up. Is there opportunity for error? Of course there is. The FBI's main problem at the time was they didn't know anything about jets or air stairs or hijacking or bailout rigs or sport rigs, or the fact that anybody would intentionally want to jump out of an airplane on purpose. All of that was completely foreign to them. What did I find? I think I found a green military bailout rig that started life as a bailout rig. What was it originally? We don't know. I thought we were looking for an NB8. Is the rig I found an NB8? It looks like it could either be an NB8 or an Air Force. Doesn't really matter. All the bailout rigs from that time period all started life as a bailout rig. They were all green. Slight differences to all of them. There's probably 30 different types of bailout rigs. I don't really care at this point whether it was an NB8 or an Air Force rig or what it was. All I can tell you is specifically this rig had been highly modified to make it go from being a bailout rig to being a sport rig. And that's what Causey told us that he did. He modified a rig for his own personal use. That means intentional parachute jump. That means the ripcord housing has got to be moved. You got to make the packing tray a little bit bigger. You got to install D-rings so you can put a belly reserve on front. All those things. Those are all the qualities that I found. And in the CNN video interview that I did not have an opportunity to answer that conclusively for CNN, and I wish that I had. Honestly, the whole thing happened so fast. I was totally unprepared for the entire interview and how that was going to go. I didn't even know where to look. They don't even tell you what camera to look at or how to conduct yourself. I thought I did okay for the lack of information that I had going in. Literally, they sit down and all of a sudden this thing is on and you're live and you're fielding these questions one after another as they come. And that was the very best that I could do.
Well, joining me now is the man who helped uncover the parachute. Dan Greider, he is a retired pilot, a YouTuber, and a d.b.cooper sleuth. Dan, great to have you here tonight. Tell me about how you found that piece of evidence and why you believe that that belonged to D.B. Cooper, who you believe is actually Richard McCoy Jr.
That's correct. Hi, Laura. Thanks for having me on. Yes, we found that parachute. It was the description of the parachute that was used that night was very, very specific in that it was modified. So all these years, for 20 years, I've been looking for this green military, highly modified parachute. And when we stumbled upon it by accident, I pulled it out and I took one look at it and I could instantly see the modifications. I've already discussed this and addressed this thing about disguise. Yes, of course, McCoy wore a disguise or both. And think about the name, Dan Cooper. Dan Cooper was a comic book legend, common in Europe. It was a French-Canadian cartoon that was very popular in Europe. Dan Cooper was a cartoon image. The alias that McCoy used on the second one was James Johnson. James Johnson was a U.S. lieutenant colonel, fighter pilot. He fought in World War II, and he had kills, he had everything. He was a parachute guy, he was a jet guy, he was a fighter guy. It was somebody that Richard Floyd McCoy looked up to equally. Dan Cooper was his first alias. James Johnson was his second one. He signed both of those. We're going to talk about the cigarettes, the Raleigh brand cigarettes, in just a second. But I think it's interesting that the FBI agenda, our government agenda changed. Initially, their agenda was to find the guy. When they couldn't find him and they got absolutely snowballed, their agenda became to cover it up. Even to this day, their agenda, the FBI agenda on this is anybody but McCoy. Absolutely, please, anybody but McCoy. That exists today. I'm going to read this 302. If you notice, the hijacking occurred in November of 71. This 302 was written in August of 72 after they're still trying to substantiate and show their bosses that they didn't miss it and McCoy was not it. They're trying to tell you that it could not possibly be McCoy because they have a 302 that says that he wasn't. Well, this is not handwritten by the person who was there. This is a 302 written by FBI who told it to an FBI who told it to an FBI who told it to a secretary who typed it up. I'm going to read it to you. This is from August 15 of 72. It's on your screen. So-and-so says that he was a student at Brigham Young University working on his master's degree. He stated that he remembers Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. and recalled he was at his residence on Thanksgiving Day, 1971. He stated he met McCoy in a law enforcement class. He stated McCoy had told him that he had been in Southeast Asia in the military and that he planned to return there after his graduation. He stated McCoy invited him to his home on Thanksgiving, but he did not remember anything that was said by McCoy or any of the other guests. So you got this 302 from this magic mystery Taiwanese guy that goes to their house for Thanksgiving, but he can't remember anything about it. This is in August of 72, and now it's a 302. FBI is going to completely hang their hat on Denise's testimony. Denise is the sister-in-law. Denise's alibi. Denise provided the alibi that said that Richard Floyd McCoy was home for Thanksgiving, and yet there's gas receipts and other credit card information from Las Vegas, 1971. Denise tells you in her own words, Karen and Richard McCoy were gone from Provo 3 or 4 days, Thanksgiving of 1971. I got this interview I'm going to play next. This 302, this is the agencies, this is the FBI's absolute scapegoat. They use this as a form of perjury. They still use this today. They can write down what they think that you said and present it in court and call you for perjury. If your testimony differs from what's written down on the 302, you're off to the races for perjury. Isn't that crazy? That's an FBI tactic. That is the agenda of the FBI, to be able to use their 302 to write down whatever they want with no substantiation at all and call it good. The FBI 302 trumps a witness statement on the stand. Isn't that something? Here's a interview that I did with the guy that I found recently. It took me a long time to track him down. This is very interesting. This is not rock solid DNA evidence, but this is an interesting story concerning Raleigh, North Carolina, and the fact that this Raleigh connection and Raleigh cigarettes, the hijacker on the D.B. Cooper hijacking smoked Raleigh cigarettes. That's a cigarette that was not even available in the Pacific Northwest at the time. It's a cheap brand of cigarette, not available, and yet the hijacker smoked Raleigh cigarettes. The FBI, amazingly enough, I can tell you right now, Larry Carr, our FBI agent that handled the case, he says that those cigarette butts got lost. Also, the hair slides, the actual hair samples retrieved from the airplane that night, those also got mysteriously lost. Isn't that something? Here's the interview that I did with my friend that was in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1972, and here's the interesting story that he told me. Sitting here at the table today with my friend Gray Booth. Thank you for coming out. I can tell you.
Good to see you, Dan.
Good to see you. It took a little while to find you, but you've got a fascinating story, and I'm going to jump right in and get to your story.
Okay.
You're from the state of
North Carolina.
North Carolina, and you're about 70. What's
72.
You're 72. Tell me what was going on with you in the summer of 72. Where were you, and what was going on in your life?
Well, I was at North Carolina State University in ROTC getting ready to go to my summer camp the summer of that year. And so I had to go on campus and get additional uniforms to have for the summer camp, as we only had a very limited amount for on campus.
Correct. So the backstory is this is a ROTC thing.
Correct.
You're using government money to pay for college.
That's right.
Like a lot of people did. What was the sentiment back then nationwide in summer of 72 coming out of the Vietnam era? Nationwide, what do you remember about the sentiment of the country concerning the war and the war efforts?
Well, obviously on campus at the time, all campuses across the country, there's a very pronounced anti-war sentiment with all the people that were going to Vietnam and not coming back.
Yes.
So it's a very big anti-war sentiment.
So you sign up for ROTC so you can pay for college because you're a poor boy from North Carolina.
That's right.
And you got to have the help. Now, this is University of North Carolina in...
No, North Carolina State University.
Okay, North Carolina State University in the city of...
Raleigh.
In Raleigh. You get assigned to go to a location. Tell me the location that they told you to go to pick up your uniform that you're going to need for summer camp. Tell me about that.
Okay, well, there was an old football stadium on campus, Riddick Field, and it had an old field house there, which is where they, to the best of my recollection, that they kept all of the ROTC paraphernalia and everything, and that's where you pick up your uniforms, anything associated with the ROTC program.
And you went there to get your stuff. You entered the building to get assigned and fit a uniform that you're going to need in the summer. Tell me the name of the person that you met that day.
I met Richard Floyd McCoy. He was the person that was responsible for maintaining all of the ROTC equipment there at NC State University.
Yes, and when you met Richard Floyd McCoy, that didn't mean anything to you at the time, probably. You met him, but in the process of this interaction, now it's just you. This is Richard Floyd McCoy Sr.
That's correct.
We come to find out now, who was an Army vet who ended up working for the government somehow in the distribution of uniforms and things like that at NC State Fieldhouse. This is 53 years ago.
Right.
And you're 72 years old. How clear is your memory about what that man told you that day?
Oh, it's very clear. I mean, when you hear something like what he told me, it's something that sticks with you, being a national story during that period of time.
Yes. And tell me exactly, what did he tell you that day?
Well, that day in our conversations while he was fitting the uniforms and everything, don't know exactly how we got on it, but he made the statement that my son is D.B. Cooper. And of course, at the time, his son basically had just been arrested by the FBI for another hijacking, and that's what he stated. He seemed, just very concerned as a parent.
Yes. Now, the summer camp that you ended up going to would have been in the summer of 72.
That's
so
right.
You're probably picking up your uniform at the conclusion of spring semester at NC State. Set the timeline for me. Approximately what month and year would this conversation with Richard Floyd McCoy have been?
Well, our exams at that period of time were in early May, so likely the latter part of April.
End of April
Of 72.
of 72. And the hijacking occurs in early April of 72. He's obviously aware that his son has been involved in a hijacking.
Right.
And he gives you that information. How is it that this information, this nugget of information, has stayed in your brain for 53 years? How pronounced of an impact was that when he told you that?
Well, obviously, for such a national story, it's like, wow, what did he just say? And it's just something that sticks with you because it's so unusual.
Yes. And you're from North Carolina.
That's right.
It's tobacco country.
That's correct.
There was a company out there that producing tobacco products and cigarettes at the time, Raleigh cigarettes.
That's right.
The brand of the cigarette that was used on the D.B. Cooper hijacking that night was not available in the Pacific Northwest at the time. What was the brand of the cigarette left on board the airplane that night?
Well, in the news they stated it was Raleigh cigarettes.
Well, there's this guy named Larry Carr. He was the case agent for a few years back in 2007 or something like that. Remember, the FBI goes on purely on the basis of science and evidence. Science and evidence. It's going to be rock solid. They're going to have to tell you exactly what happened. Let's listen to Larry Carr. First of all, let's listen to who he is.
My name's Larry Carr. I'm the case agent for the D.B. Cooper case out of the FBI's Seattle office.
Here's Larry Carr's explanation using science and evidence. Let's listen to Larry Carr tell you what happened when the skyjacker left the airplane Thanksgiving of 71. What happened to him? This is according to FBI agent Larry Carr.
And so when he jumps out of the aircraft, I think he just started tumbling right then. Just tumbling, panics. And once you panic, you really can't do anything. So he's falling. He doesn't know where he's at. He can't see. He has no visual reference on the ground. He's out of control in the air and starts to panic, can't pull his chute, and hits the ground with never opening his chute.
There's been others out there. Everybody from all over the place, the lowest of the low in America, all the way down to Mississippi criminal defense lawyers have weighed in on this thing. They got no idea what they're talking about. Even this guy, Auriculus, whoever this is, Auriculus, tells you that the skyjacker left the airplane in Seattle immediately upon takeoff, leaving Seattle. This is this guy, Auriculus, who tells us this.
I believe Cooper's plans were to jump really almost immediately after the jet took off from Seattle. I believe his plans were to jump right there in the outskirts of Seattle or the exurbs of Seattle.
Hey man, if his DNA, look, if Richard McCoy's DNA is somehow on that necktie, then so be it. I'll be out of the job then. That's great. I can learn how to golf at that point. How about that?
Recently, I came across this tape that has been buried in the archives for a long time. I'm going to conclude this video, D.B. Cooper, Part 4, Deep Government Agenda, with this tape. This is solid gold, done by a guy named Lars Larson, personal friend of mine, at least he is now. Allowed me to use this tape. I did a Zoom call with him. He's going to tell you, Lars will tell you exactly that Richard Floyd McCoy was definitely D.B. Cooper, and he knew it in 1992. Lars is the guy that went and interviewed the two guys that wrote the book. He also interviewed the FBI on camera. That on-camera interview is on here, and specifically, he asks the FBI, was it Richard Floyd McCoy, and they eliminate him. FBI eliminates him, which the FBI is not in the business of eliminating anybody on this early basis yet. They can't do it, and yet they went out on a limb and eliminated Richard Floyd McCoy on tape on the basis of Denise's testimony and this August 15th 302. That's the only thing that they have to eliminate Richard Floyd McCoy. I'm going to leave you with this. This is the Zoom call with Lars. He's going to give you the backstory on it, and then right after that, I'll put the video that Lars actually produced for his news station back in 1992. In the studio today with Lars. Larson, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, Dan. Thanks for the invitation.
I appreciate this. It's going to be very, very quick here, but you produced something that I just came across that I don't believe the world has ever seen. It is exquisitely done from a long time ago, back when you actually had hair and it was a lot darker.
Yes, I did. And that's what TV does to you. They told me I had a face for radio, so I had to go back to radio instead. I did 20 years in television out of 50 years in broadcast. Radio is a lot more fun, and these days podcasting too.
Exactly. Well, you took the initiative and you went and interviewed the two guys,
Russ Callum and Bernie Rhodes. And to tell you who they were, we do that in the piece, but they were respectively the former special agent in charge, called the SAC, of the FBI office in Salt Lake, Utah, and also the former federal head of federal parole and probation. And these two gentlemen worked together. And after their service in government, they decided to write this book because they were convinced that Richard Floyd McCoy of Provo, Utah, was in fact D.B. Cooper. And while they didn't indict the FBI and say, these guys screwed it up, I read the book. I said, I ran across the book, and I don't even remember how I ran across it back in those days before the internet, before social media and all that. I just saw the book and thought, well, I'm interested in Cooper. He's here in the Northwest. Let's do a piece on this. And we flew down to Salt Lake and interviewed both Callum and Rhodes and talked to them about the very tight case they'd made back then that Richard Floyd McCoy is in fact, or was in fact, D.B. Cooper. He's dead now. And so we put this piece together, and the news magazine we produced was once a week, Sunday nights at 9 o'clock. And this piece was around 13 or 14 minutes long. And we put everything we could cram into it because we couldn't begin to touch all the detail that's in Callum and Rhodes' book.
Yes. And you even went and interviewed the FBI. To me, the theme that I have here is deep government agenda. They had an agenda here that clearly switched around. Originally, they were trying to catch the guy. When they couldn't catch him, they got embarrassed. They figured out that who it was, but now they had been in his home, an illegal search and seizure. They had a real problem. Now it turned over to an agenda. They wanted to no longer be embarrassed, and they wanted to cover this up. There's a thing called an FBI 302. I'm going to put it on the screen and read it real quick. But this FBI 302 is basically a document that the FBI can create without any witness signature or with any substantiation. In August of 1972, now they want to come up with an FBI 302 that substantiates that McCoy was in his home for Thanksgiving. This 302, I've got it on the screen here right now, it magically appears and says this unknown student from Asia who is yet to be named was at the McCoy home. Now, when you went and interviewed the FBI, you went to Seattle and you interviewed the guy. Tell us the difference between what FBI normally does as far as naming or not naming people, and what did they tell you? You personally interviewed the FBI guy in Seattle, and that's all in your document.
And in the actual piece, we show the interview with an FBI agent in Portland, the SAC for Portland at the time, back in '92. And he said specifically, we have excluded Richard McCoy as a suspect. Now, ordinarily, the FBI does not talk a lot about its investigation. So, for instance, if I called the FBI and said, are you investigating Dan Greider? They would say, we refuse to say whether we are or we are not. And it's not a bad policy because you can imagine the cloud that would be cast on any citizen if the FBI said, yeah, we're investigating Dan Greider. Well, when is that investigation going to finish? We don't know. It could go on for years. You'd sit under that cloud, nor do they generally come out and say, we have completed our investigation of Dan Greider and we have now excluded him. But in this case, I pushed them. I said, look, you had this guy in custody. You convicted him of one skyjacking, the one in April the next year after the Cooper skyjack around Thanksgiving of the previous year. You have the gas station receipt. You have a collect phone call from the Vegas Strip to the McCoy household, and they explained it away as a wrong number. Unfortunately, the telephone record showed that the call went on for minutes. Now, all of us get wrong numbers from time to time. We don't generally sit and have a long conversation with somebody who says, "Oh, I called the wrong number." They hang up, you hang up, it's over. It wasn't that kind of call. It was a longer call. And of course, what I believe is that Richard Floyd McCoy drove his car, I think it was a Volkswagen Beetle, down to Vegas, parked it in the airport parking lot, bought a ticket, flew to Portland, landed on the ground, went to the counter, which you could in those days, buy another ticket for cash, mark his name down as Dan Cooper, not DB. That was a mistake made by the AP. Gets on the plane to Seattle, hijacks the plane, says he's got a bomb, demands money and parachutes. They take off from Seattle. He bails out of the back door of the back loading ramp from the plane, which was possible on some models of planes, and disappears completely. And then almost 6 months later, a nearly identical, but from a technical standpoint, better skyjacking was staged by Richard Floyd McCoy. He got caught. So you say the FBI has this guy right in front of them. They have a collect phone call from the Vegas Strip to his home on Thanksgiving Day at the time where he might have returned to Vegas, perhaps to clean up the money, and then gas up his car and drive back to Provo, Utah, while his family is telling the FBI, no, he was at home for Thanksgiving dinner. And as you point out, they come up with this 302. Think of it as a little memo that if the police or the FBI in this case writes a report, we've had a report from somebody, we're going to commit that to paper, so we're going to memorialize it, like the lawyers say, and they write this 302 report, and they create it 9 months later to try to cover their excusing Richard Floyd McCoy, which then fast forward to 1992, 20 years later, and they say, we have excluded McCoy as a suspect, end of story.
When you sat in that office with the FBI, he specifically told you that they have excluded Richard Floyd McCoy.
You will see that in the piece. I mean, I'm one of those reporters where you get one of those halfway answers. Well, we've looked at McCoy and we're not entirely. No, I say, is he a suspect or not? Is he still considered a suspect, even though he was dead at that point, or have you excluded him? And they said, and I had to go, I don't even remember all the conversation, but I said, look, the guy's dead. He's already convicted of one skyjacking. He's dead because he died in a shootout with the FBI after he began robbing banks, after he escaped from prison. He'd escaped from jail. He also escaped from prison. This was a bad guy. He ends up dying, and it may have been a setup, as I believe that you think it was, and that case could easily be made. This guy was a gigantic embarrassment to the FBI, and they wanted him gone. So in 1992, they say on camera, on audio, to me in an interview, we have excluded him. And now here we are sitting here 32 years later, Dan, and we've got a parachute that's possessed by the now late wife of Richard McCoy, who's passed away. And where did this parachute come from? And the rigger says, that's the way I rigged the D.B. Cooper parachute, which puts the FBI right back in the bullseye again.
And when you talked to Bernie and Russ, they specifically told you, even though they were no longer working for their respective agencies, they specifically told you that they had that data, the gas receipt, the phone call, that was not disputable at the time.
Nope, it was not. And it was key evidence because, these days we have all kinds of electronic records and everybody's got a camera on their cell phone. But back then, what did you have to prove that a guy was in Vegas? Well, a collect phone call from the Vegas Strip to the Richard Floyd McCoy home that lasted for minutes. That's hard to explain. Who was it from the McCoy family or friends or family of the McCoy family who would have been on the Vegas Strip? Remember that for context, if McCoy was LDS, didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't gamble, what in the world would a non-smoking, non-drinking, non-gambling LDS member be doing in Las Vegas on the Las Vegas Strip on Thanksgiving Day, for goodness sake?
Lars, I think you did an amazing job. I'm shocked that I never saw it until recently. That's how come I called and bugged you for this intro. I want you to introduce, I'm going to play this thing on my YouTube channel in its entirety, courtesy of you and credit to you. You did an amazing job. Give me the intro for this. Tell people what they're about to see, because I'm about to put it on here next.
What you're going to see is the case made almost a third of a century ago that Richard Floyd McCoy of Provo, Utah was in fact the man who'd become known as D.B. Cooper, the skyjacker, and this piece was aired in 1992 on the news magazine called Northwest Reports on KPTV, which is the Fox affiliate in Portland, Oregon, and I did it, and yes, I look a lot younger and I have a lot more hair.
Let's watch it now.
Live in the Northwest for any length of time, and you will learn the name of D.B. Cooper. On Thanksgiving Eve, November 24th, 1971, the man using that name bought a ticket from Portland to Seattle on Northwest Airlines Flight 305 and showed the stewardess what looked like a bomb. On the ground in Seattle, he demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. As the plane flew south again, he bailed out over La Center, just north of Portland. The FBI never found Cooper, never found his parachute, and only years later found a few remnants of the money on a Columbia River beach.
Just about everybody knows that he was the only successful hijacker that ever got away.
Jim Housley, former assistant U.S. attorney from Salt Lake City, Utah, thinks he met and prosecuted the man who once called himself Dan Cooper.
The standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, and the evidence that I've disclosed to you would, I think, would be used, and in my view, would have a fair chance of convincing a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that it was McCoy who committed the Cooper hijacking. When the FBI finally caught up with him, he pulled a gun on the FBI agents that were trying to arrest him, and they shot him and killed him. That basically is a short form of the story of D.B. Cooper. Pardon me, that's the story of Richard McCoy.
That's right, Richard McCoy. And who is Richard McCoy?
And I can tell you from 20 plus years in the FBI that if, in fact, we could have made McCoy as D.B. Cooper, we would have done it. End of story.
The FBI special agent in charge in Portland, Robin Montgomery, has a simple answer for questions about D.B. Cooper and Richard McCoy.
At this point, he has been eliminated as a suspect.
He fit. He fit perfectly.
Although Housley never prosecuted McCoy for the Cooper case, he did indict and convict him for another airplane hijacking. Less than 6 months after D.B. Cooper bailed out with $200,000, former U.S. Army Green Beret Richard McCoy hijacked United Airlines Flight 855 from Denver to Los Angeles. McCoy hijacked the plane, diverted it to San Francisco, demanded parachutes and $500,000, and then he bailed out over Utah. 2 days later, the FBI arrested McCoy at his home in Provo. A search of the house turned up the grenade, the gun, and $499,970 in cash.
He was a daredevil, very courageous. He just was a fellow that had no fear.
He had demolition training. He was a fixed-wing pilot. He flew helicopters. And he, unusual with most crimes, he had the ability to look you right in the eye and scare you half to death.
He had been to Vietnam twice. He was highly decorated.
Russ Callum and Bernie Rhodes wrote the book on McCoy, literally. D.B. Cooper, the real McCoy, spells out dozens of connections between the two cases. And these are no ordinary book authors. Rhodes headed the federal parole and probation system in Utah for 20 years. Callum worked as an FBI special agent for 25 years before retiring as head of the Salt Lake office. The FBI here in Salt Lake City came to know Richard McCoy very well, and they believed that their case looked amazingly similar to the Cooper hijacking less than 6 months before. McCoy possessed a pilot's understanding of terminology and procedures. He had paratroop training and demolition training from the Army, and he knew law enforcement procedures from going to school in that area and from his friends who worked in that community. The FBI agents in Salt Lake City worked hard on the theory that McCoy might be Cooper, but they weren't in charge of the Cooper case. Those agents were hundreds of miles away in Seattle, Washington, and they didn't believe that Richard McCoy was Dan Cooper.
They made some very blatant mistakes.
Bernie Rhodes points out that D.B. Cooper created a whole new kind of crime, skyjacking for the purpose of extortion. He says the FBI had never handled that kind of crime before. Years later, Rhodes talked to one of the FBI agents who worked the Cooper case.
He said, you know, we'd made a lot of mistakes and we were scolded by Washington, D.C.
What kind of mistakes? Well, Rhodes points out that the FBI never collected magazines and other articles from the plane that Cooper touched, evidence that might have provided the man's fingerprints. The plane landed in Reno, and Rhodes says the FBI let the tiny Reno crime lab process the evidence. The FBI in Salt Lake City had problems following up on the McCoy-Cooper connection. Callum, who was retiring when agents arrested McCoy in the United hijacking, says he briefed the man who took over the Salt Lake FBI office.
He didn't have any interest in it. It wasn't, I couldn't understand his lack of interest.
Yet there seems good reason to believe Cooper and McCoy were the same man. Start with the way they look.
And if you compare the picture that the witnesses to the D.B. Cooper case came up with this aid of a police artist, it looks exactly like Richard McCoy.
Former prosecutor Jim Housley.
Well, the modus operandi, the MO, had McCoy's signature all over it.
The man who hijacked Northwest Flight 305 called himself Dan Cooper. The news media apparently changed it to DB. He used notes typed ahead of time to tell the pilot where to fly the plane. Richard McCoy, a helicopter and fixed-wing pilot, did exactly the same thing on United Airlines Flight 855 6 months later.
And it would have vectors and directions and things like that on it that were things that that an ordinary person like myself or maybe like you wouldn't know about.
The hijackers used something a bit more unique than typing paper for their notes.
They used aviation flight plans, both of them. There wasn't any way Richard McCoy would have known about that because those had been protected. That kind of evidence in the D.B. Cooper case was protected by the FBI.
You'll see in both cases, Cooper and McCoy, that he used what we, well, how would you best describe it? I guess it would be pilot lingo and aft staircase, interphone.
The flight crews of both planes remember the hijacker kept using the phrase, "no funny stuff." Both hijackers specified where the refueling truck should be parked, probably to prevent the FBI from using it as cover during an assault on the plane. Rhodes and Callum say McCoy's hijacking showed improvements from the Cooper case. Each hijacker had a stewardess nearby to carry notes to the pilot.
In the Cooper case, he had her sit pretty much alongside of him. In the McCoy case, he had her sit in front of him. Much improvement there. Because she couldn't look and turn around and really study him and see him and look at his hand.
In the Cooper case, the FBI delivered the money in a bag with the zippers removed. Rhodes and Callum figure McCoy, under the name of Cooper, lost most of the money and therefore had to do a second hijacking.
He brought a duffel bag the second time, had a lot of things stored in it.
McCoy brought his own parachute and equipment to attach the money bag to his parachute harness. Another improvement, in the Cooper hijacking, the flight crew got a good look at the man through a peephole in the cockpit door.
He taped that over in the McCoy case real quick so that they couldn't use that peephole. He knew what he was doing. He really did.
Both hijacked planes were 727s, with staircases in the rear that could be lowered.
D.B. Cooper didn't know how to open that back door. D.B. Cooper had to have help, but Richard McCoy comes along about 5.5 months later. He didn't need any help from Diane Serdam. He sent her up front.
Witnesses described Cooper as dark-skinned and older, with yellow stains on his fingers.
We know in the McCoy case that he put a heavy, dark makeup on.
Former Utah FBI Chief Russ Callum figures McCoy got makeup on his first 2 fingers while putting on the makeup in the Cooper case, and the crew mistook it for nicotine stains from smoking.
They both sat in the same seat, and one of them, Cooper, left the string tie, which Tina Mucklow was the stewardess, gave to the FBI and told them that she'd seen D.B. Cooper take the tie off.
The Seattle FBI office confirms that it still has a thin black tie and a mother-of-pearl tie tack that D.B. Cooper left on the plane.
D.B. Cooper left a clue on the airplane. The clue that he left on the airplane was a tie tack. a very distinctive tie tack.
Former prosecutor Jim Housley figures that clue ties McCoy to Cooper.
In the investigation of the McCoy case, they found a Polaroid picture of McCoy wearing a tie with that tie tack.
McCoy's mother-in-law and his sister-in-law were both shown a photograph of the tie clasp and the necktie. And their reaction was that that's like McCoy's, or that is McCoy's.
Denise, in particular, according to Jim Tyson, said, well, that's Richard's. Where'd you fellas get it? And he said, well, we got it off of the D.B. Cooper plane, and she broke into tears.
The FBI says the tie does not link McCoy to Cooper.
There was nothing unique about it, as you will. And then there was a simulated pearl tie clasp.
Yet the FBI, to this day, refuses to let the public see the tie because agents say it might still be used to identify the skyjacker.
Cooper was described, if you recall, as being about 45 years of age, kind of having a swarthy complexion. I think while he was in the plane, he smoked, and he did have a drink.
The FBI's Robin Montgomery points out that as a Mormon, McCoy neither drank nor did he smoke. But Callum and Rhodes point out that McCoy used to do both before he converted. Would a man careful enough to wear makeup and a wig, as McCoy did in one hijacking, disguise himself in other ways?
I think he could have smoked them to throw you off.
There were a couple of inconsistencies.
The FBI insists McCoy could not have committed the Cooper hijack.
One, McCoy was back at his residence in Utah, I think that Thanksgiving day, which would have been the day after the hijacking.
The man who called himself D.B. Cooper hijacked that Northwest Airlines jet on Thanksgiving Eve. Now, Richard McCoy's family says that he spent the Thanksgiving holiday right here in Provo, Utah. That he helped cook dinner on Thanksgiving Day and stayed all evening. But authors Russ Callum and Bernie Rhodes say the documents they dug up show something entirely different. They show that Richard McCoy, a devout Mormon, a non-smoker, a non-drinker, and a non-gambler, wasn't here in Provo. He was 372 miles away in Las Vegas.
There was gasoline bought by a fellow driving a Volkswagen with a North Carolina plate assigned to McCoy, okay? And he signed a gas ticket on his credit card, and the FBI laboratory said he wrote the signature, Richard McCoy.
And where was that gas bought?
And that gas was bought at that thrust station, power thrust station, just west of the airport, McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas.
Half a mile from that gas station sits the Tropicana Hotel and Casino,
where he made a phone call from a commercial phone. Now, the other thing that puts him, there was a phone call made from the Tropicana Collect to McCoy's home at 11:10 or 10:10, that evening, Thanksgiving evening.
What is a man that doesn't shoot dice, play blackjack, drink whiskey, chase women, smoke cigarettes, do in Las Vegas, Nevada on Thanksgiving?
Bernie Rhodes thinks he knows the answer to that question.
Probably when he got back from Portland, laundered the money there at the Tropicana or maybe a number of hotels, and then got on the phone and called home and he said, "It's over, I'm on my way." I think that's a logical thing to do.
The Federal Marshal Service assigned one man to guard Richard McCoy during his trial. John Seiler says McCoy talked openly about his own hijacking, the one he was on trial for, and he says McCoy claimed to know something about the Cooper hijacking, something that only Dan Cooper would have known at the time.
He said that in the Cooper case, when Cooper bailed out and his chute opened, the jolt jarred the money from his grasp, and he lost the money.
John Seiler assumed that McCoy had read something in the newspaper. Only years later, when some of the money turned up, did Seiler realize that McCoy knew something that only Cooper should have known.
Well, he lost all but I think around $10,000 or $12,000.
Rhodes points out that Cooper had to contend with a bank bag full of money from which the FBI had removed all zippers.
The woman, the stewardess, did see him take apart a chute, if you will, cut the shrouds, the nylon shrouds, and it looked like he was tying the money up in a package to make it tighter.
Callum says that when Cooper let some of the stewardesses go in Seattle, Cooper did a Robin Hood.
He offered him a pack. A pack of 100 is $2,000.
Offered one to each of the gals that were getting off of the plane. And he said, "Here, take those. It's Thanksgiving, and and you've been nice to me, or something to that effect.
The crew turned down the offer, and Cooper stuffed the packs into his suit. Rhodes and Callum figured Cooper, or McCoy, lost the money, all of it except what he had pocketed. His close friends told Northwest Reports that McCoy, who was in school at the time on the GI Bill and whose wife did social work, was always short of money.
Then, after the Cooper jump in November of '71, he took his sister-in-law, his wife, and 2 children and flew them back to Carolina. He paid for that right off to the credit card company. Now we're talking about a sizable amount. He bought new tires for his car. He did a number of things that showed that money was a little easier.
A judge sentenced McCoy to 45 years in a federal prison. 2 years later, he escaped and began robbing banks. 4 months later, the FBI caught up with him. He fired 1 shot. 3 agents shot back, killing him.
I can only tell you that this case is still unsolved as far as the FBI is concerned.
Well, wasn't that something? I appreciate that, Lars, very much, and thank you all for your support on this thing. D.B. Cooper, Part 4, Deep Government Agenda. Do you believe that our government has an agenda? Do you think that they change and twist things to make it meet their own agenda? Of course they do. They're still doing it. Right now, the FBI wants anything but McCoy. Absolutely, they do not want this. The entire agenda of the U.S. government, they have been mortified. Remember in Deep FBI Secrets, my D.B. Cooper video Part 2, Nick O'Hara tells you that he shot him and let him bleed out there in the lawn. If you get a chance to go back and listen to that, that's the FBI telling you that he was conscious of the fact that he shot him point blank, let him lay on the ground, let him bleed. That's him in his own words telling you what he did to him. Also, the reason that they were in that house that night and the reason that they were knew to do that stakeout and be inside the house and wait for Richard Floyd McCoy to approach the doorstep that night, it's because they made a deal with Walker. Walker was already serving 90 years in federal prison before he broke out of prison with Richard Floyd McCoy. After the shootout in Virginia Beach where they killed Richard Floyd McCoy, Walker only did 6 more years and he was paroled a free man, free to walk the streets of America all by himself with his debt to society completely paid in full. It's because of the deal he made with the FBI and the FBI's deep government agenda. It's the deep government agenda. There, at that point, their agenda was kill Richard Floyd McCoy, and they pulled it off.
This is just little snippets of information that I have, that I know about, that Cooper would know about. And, you know, we're going to keep those right in here.